I increased my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175 and worked through over 40 official LSAT practice tests. The less impressive part is that it took me over an entire year, and I probably could have done it in less than half the time. Far too many of the students I speak with are taking test after test after test, burning through valuable practice material when they should be taking fewer exams and reviewing them in more depth. So when we look at what's it going to take for you to score a 170 or above on the LSAT, it may not be that you need to put in more time, but instead, maybe you could actually be putting in less time if you studied more efficiently. A lot of students I speak with fall into the trap of taking a timed practice test every single day. They figure there's dozens of practice tests, dozens of days left till the test, do one single exam every single day, and then the score will improve simply as a function of how many tests you take. The key piece of the equation that is missing here, however, is taking the time to review and learn from your mistakes. If you were to do half the practice tests and review those mistakes in depth, you could get a bigger score increase. On average, the typical student can expect to increase their LSAT score by 1 point for every practice test they do. So maybe you do 20 exams, you improve your score 20 points. Maybe, maybe not. It's a whole lot easier after all to go from a 120 to a 140 than from a 160 to a 180, but I understand the idea that doing more practice questions will get you more pattern recognition of the methods of reasoning that LSAC uses. More pattern recognition means more questions correct on test day. That makes sense. However, you could get a bigger score increase by doing fewer practice questions if you thoroughly review the mistakes you were making to get a deeper understanding of those methods of reasoning. Because the better you understand the methods of reasoning that LSAC is using, the more likely you are to spot them on test day, and the more likely you are to be able to do so quickly. So to put it a different way here, when I see a new LSAT question, it's not really my first time seeing that question because I've seen that method of reasoning before. Maybe it was in a different context. Maybe the topic was different. Maybe the question type was different, but the underlying method of reasoning was the same, because it turns out that the people who make the LSAT are actually really lazy. They love taking old questions and just remixing them a little bit and passing it off as something new. This was especially apparent on the logic game section, which sadly is no longer with us, but it is equally true of logical reasoning as well, even if it is a little bit more difficult to spot. I'll give you an example. Let's say there is a classic LSAT method of reasoning like confusing correlation for causation. This method of reasoning will show up in one context with regard to speed limits and driving cars. In another context, it shows up with regard to climate change. In another question, it shows up with regard to dinosaur extinction. Same method of reasoning, different topics. Correlation causation can be tested, of course, in flaw questions, but also in strengthen, weaken, resolve the paradox, and so on. Now, there are plenty of other methods of reasoning as well, some of which are not classic, but are rather more unique or atypical. But either way, they still show up every now and then. The more LSAT questions that you are exposed to, and the better you understand those methods of reasoning, the more likely you are to recognize and understand that method of reasoning when it shows up in a new, unique situation with a different perspective put on it, meaning a different question type. So one context, correlation causation question, dinosaur extinction, flaw. Another context, same correlation causation method of reasoning, but this time it's a strengthening question and it's about cars and speed limits. If you understand correlation causation inside out, you will be able to spot it in both contexts. But how do we make sure that you actually understand correlation causation well enough to spot it in all these different contexts? It comes down to deeply understanding that method of reasoning regardless of the context. And you develop that deep understanding through reviewing questions in depth. If you understand questions in depth, if you review them in depth, then you can improve your score by 2 points for every practice test you complete, rather than only 1 point. So this means you could do half the practice tests, but review in depth and get the same increase, or if you were to perhaps spread your LSAT prep over a slightly longer period of time, you could get a much larger LSAT score increase because you would be able to do an equal number of practice tests as the other approach, but by reviewing in depth, you would be doubling your LSAT score increase that you get from your LSAT prep. If you'd like my help with this, of course, at LSAT Unplugged, we walk you through this Socratic review method process in our live one-on-one coaching programs and our small group coaching programs as well. And it is especially important now that the LSAT has changed that you work on logical reasoning, because it is now 2/3 of the test. So whereas it used to be only 1/3, now it's doubled in importance, so any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across the two sections. Now, I spoke a lot here about evaluating methods of reasoning and reviewing them in depth, but of course, it is also important to look at question stem recognition and evaluating answer choices, tempting wrong answers, unappealing right answers. What are the tricks and traps that you personally are uniquely prone to falling for, so that you can avoid, of course, making the same mistakes again? That's what it's all about. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.